Money, money, money must be funny in the rich man's world. Money, 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 always sunny in the rich man's world. All the things I could do if I had a little money. Well, ABBA's words from 1976 still ring true in the Western world today. We live in a part of the world that is remarkably affluent. Yet, we humans still have this uncanny ability to notice how others around us seem to have more than we do. If only I had a bit more. If only I had a car like them. If only I had a house like them. And so there are podcasts, books, financial advisors, investment strategies, an entire industry dedicated to building personal wealth. For example, Jack Henderson is a 28-year-old man in Sydney who runs a property advisory firm, and he owns 15 investment properties after buying his first home at 18 years old. And he's recently broadcasted some financial advice, somewhat controversial, not to pay off your mortgage, but instead to buy more investment properties, to build wealth long-term, to have the financial freedom to invest in other areas. Wealthy wisdom or financial folly? Well, it's a bit divisive. As you might expect, there are some people, quite a lot, who disagree with his advice because of the enormous amounts of interest you end up paying on all those loans. But as we'll see today, that there's a much, much deeper problem with financial advice like this. In fact, any financial advice that leaves God out of the picture. As we heard from Job over the summer, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. And Proverbs similarly says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. To live with wisdom in any area of life, money, for example, begins with a fear of the Lord. Begins with keeping God in his right place. And that was a key feature of the passage last week, not to fear man, but to fear God. So the question today is, how does a right fear of the Lord affect the way we view money? What is true financial wisdom according to Jesus? Well, come with me to verse 13 and let's take a look. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." It's a bit of a sibling squabble here, as sadly often happens over some inheritance money. And one of them sees Jesus' authority. He wants him to lay down the law. But we could almost hear these words, or words like this, coming out of the mouth of a child, squabbling over a toy. Tell my brother to share with me. But Jesus is not here to settle family disputes. So instead, he uses the opportunity to warn this man and the whole crowd of this spiritual danger. Verse 14, Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed." It seems like Jesus has seen the real motivation that could be lurking underneath this man's request. Greed. It's sneaky. He might not even be so aware of it himself. But I've heard quite a couple of pastors actually say, seasoned pastors, that say that in all their years of ministry, all the various confessions they've heard, very rarely or never does someone confess to them, "I actually struggle with the problem of greed." All sorts of other sins get confessed before this one, it seems. And why is that? Do we think it's less common? I don't think so. But greed is subtle, it's sneaky. And especially in our culture, the line between what we need and what we want gets very blurry, doesn't it? With such a high standard of living as we have here. And the reason it's so dangerous, Jesus states what should be obvious to us. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. See, greed can cause a distorted view of what life is really about. So Jesus warns us with a parable. Verse 16, "The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest, and And he thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Seems like a natural, innocent dilemma. Not enough space for all his goods. We might call it a first world problem, having too many things to fit in the house. But he thought to himself, he literally said to his soul, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. He plans to build bigger barns, save up for the future. In many ways, it seems like quite a sensible, wise thing to do. Many of us keep savings in the bank. He's finding a secure place for his surplus to safeguard the future. He says to himself, I've got savings to last for years. I can relax, take life easy, enjoy myself. But you might have noticed that his language is literally full of himself. This is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns, my grain. I'll say to myself. His approach is entirely self-centered and self-indulgent, laying up treasure only for himself. He's converted this windfall into financial security, but it's a false security. Verse 20, God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you, or your soul will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you've prepared for yourself? He says to his soul, relax, take life easy. No, tonight it'll be demanded of you. He says to himself, I'll enjoy my possessions. No, it's going to go to someone else. This might remind us of a memory verse from the summer. What good is it to gain the whole world yet forfeit your soul? He is a fool. Not that he's brainless, but he's godless. It's more about what's happening in his heart than what he actually does. As Psalm 14 says, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. He doesn't consider that God will call him to account. He doesn't consider that God has given him all the wealth he has for a purpose beyond himself. And so Jesus gives the final warning of the parable in verse 21. This is how it will be for whoever stores up treasure for themselves, but is not rich towards God. See, the issue in the parable is not having wealth itself, but it's how it's viewed and how it's directed. It mustn't be viewed as our security or our identity, or directed just for our own purposes and benefit, but it's got to be seen as temporary for what it is, and the purpose for God and others. See, what happens when we lack a fear of God around our money? What can happen? When money is big and God is small, what can happen? Well, money becomes our security. Possessions become our life. We start to see our earnings as ours deserved for ourselves rather than God's generous provision for us and for others. But to this attitude, money is big, God is small, God says, you fool. So be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Then Jesus turns to his disciples in this second half, and he teaches true wisdom around wealth. We've seen folly, now we see wisdom, how to be rich towards God. Have a look at verse 22. Then Jesus said to his disciples, therefore I tell you, but before we go on, what's the therefore? Well, he's continuing on in the same topic. He's continuing the teaching. He's giving the flip side of this topic. He says, listen in, disciples, you who want to live for me, who want to have a rich relationship with God, listen in. Therefore, I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, about your body, what you will wear. Why? For life is more than food and the body more than clothes. Even though these are basic, fundamental needs, food and clothing are not actually life's most important concern. The most important concern is to be rich towards God. This is what the rich fool was missing on the night he died, because real security can only be found in God. So put your trust in him, not in money. Because Jesus is drawing out two types of folly here. One is the building bigger barns, storing up for the future, trusting in wealth. The other is actually worrying about an empty fridge, trusting in wealth in another way. Both people wish they could have more. Both people look at what their neighbours have and think, wouldn't it be nice if I had what they had? See, we may tend to think that you're only at risk of worldliness when you're wealthy, but Jesus points out you can be poor and putting your trust in wealth as well. You can be poor and see money as big and see God as small. He illustrates this with a couple of examples from everyday life. Verse 24, consider the ravens. They do not sow or reap. They have no storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them. And how much more valuable are you than birds? Well, the ravens were unclean animals under Jewish law, wild birds. Yet Jesus says, look at how God feeds them. Perhaps in our day, he might say, consider the ibis, that prolific bin chicken. They don't collect or store food, yet God feeds them. And how much more valuable are you than that dirty bird? You are of much greater value than the ibis. He then points to the flowers. Consider how the wild flowers grow. Verse 27. They do not labor or spin, yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. Again, not a domesticated plant, an orchid in someone's living room, but to wild flowers. It makes me think of frangipanis. They're everywhere. They grow so easily. They're all down this street. And they have these beautiful, sweet-smelling flowers. But the flowers are there one day, and the next day, what are they? They're brown mush on the footpath. Here one day and gone the next. If God makes them beautiful and fragrant, even though they're so short-lived, how much more will he clothe you, O you of little faith? So Jesus says, don't worry. Not only is it pointless, verse 25, but these examples show us why we don't need to worry. So when that next medical bill comes around, or when the school fees are due, or when you need to find another job, don't think, it'll be okay because I've got some savings in the bank. No, that's much closer to the attitude of the rich fool, relying on a storeroom. No, we can be confident for a much greater reason, that we will be clothed and cared for, because in God's sight, we are much more valuable than bin chickens and frangipanis. We are his beloved children. As we just sung, my value fixed, my ransom paid at the cross. We are much greater value in his sight than birds and flowers. Verse 30 says, for the pagan world runs after such things, and your Father knows you need them. We don't need to run after these things, be anxiously fretting and worrying, because God is our Father. You might have noticed that so far in the passage it says, God, 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 and then here in verse 30 it switches to your Father. Your Father. That's who you get to call God. This is a reality that sets us completely apart from the world. We know him as our Father, and he knows what we need. There's a security in this reality that far surpasses any bank balance, any property portfolio, or any superannuation scheme. The God who made all things, who has infinite resources at his disposal, promises to supply our needs. So, child of God, quit your worrying and instead pray to your perfect Father who loves you and knows what you need. Knowing this, knowing our value in God's eyes and his care for us, it actually liberates us. It frees us to pursue his kingdom ahead of the things of this world. You know, we may still buy new houses, new clothes, enjoy delicious food and drink, but beware that we don't do it the way the pagan world does. They run after these things. They chase after it like chasing the wind. They're storing up treasure on earth, building bigger barns, chasing after the best lifestyle. But our security and purpose are found elsewhere. Jesus says to his disciples, verse 31, "Seek his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well." What does it actually mean to seek his kingdom? Well, we desire for him to be represented here on earth, that his kingly rule might be recognized by more and more people who don't yet know him, and for his rule to be more and more evident in our own lives. And we have all we need to do this, to pursue the kingdom without reservation. Verse 32 says, "Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom." The disciples shouldn't be afraid. We shouldn't be afraid, not through any strength of our own. Jesus calls them little flock, like a handful of little vulnerable sheepies. The reason they and we ought not to be afraid is because God is pleased to give us the kingdom. What does this mean? It seems that we've already received salvation and relationship with God, the kingdom in that sense, the now kingdom, but also the not yet kingdom, the act of seeking that his kingdom might come, that his kingdom might grow, is actually worthwhile and achievable. It's something that God guarantees will happen. So Jesus says in verse 33, "Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out. Provide a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." So, brothers and sisters, detach your heartstrings from possessions and wealth in this world, because they're only temporary. They're given to us to generously use them for his kingdom, to generously care for those in need, storing up treasure in heaven, because that is the investment guaranteed for eternity. As it was said so well by Jim Elliot, a missionary who was martyred in the jungle of South America, he said this: "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." So where is your heart? What excites you? What worries you? Are you excited by a new car, some new clothing, the next paycheck, or a paycheck with a bonus? Well, what would God have you excited about or worried about? Perhaps more the way a part of the Bible clicks for you or one of your home group friends during the week. Perhaps the way the youth and the kids at our church are learning more what it means to live for Jesus. It seems that the way God tunes our heart, helps us to be excited what he's excited about, is by his Spirit and through choices we make. And praise God for the way so many of you are making choices to sacrificially seek his kingdom. But what's the next step? To seek God's kingdom even more sacrificially and trust him even more to provide your needs. Now, with 100 people in the room, there's probably 100 different answers to that question. But perhaps here are some ideas. Perhaps it could be reducing your work hours so that you have more time and energy for prayer, for teaching your kids about the Lord, for involvement at church. Perhaps it could be getting more hours, getting a part-time job so that you do have something to financially contribute to God's kingdom here or around the world. Perhaps it could be taking a year off to study God's word at Bible college and be equipped for the kingdom, more equipped for the kingdom. Perhaps it could be what Jesus said to his disciples, selling some possessions and giving to the poor. So many of us have much more than what we need. Perhaps it's as simple as taking the time daily to pray, Father in heaven, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come. Give us today our daily bread. And then giving him thanks and praise from the heart when he does provide for us. What will your next step be to seek his kingdom and trust his provision? Well, Benson Barnett was the principal who founded Sydney Missionary and Bible College over 100 years ago. And that's where I studied, where Dave and Janet both taught, where David Cook was also the principal for some years. And this is a history written in 2016 of their 100-year anniversary. And in the first 10 years, the college was really struggling financially. But Benson Barnett and his wife Elizabeth prayed and worked constantly so that people might continue to be equipped to grow the kingdom across the world. In 1920, here are a couple of entries in his diary. Lord, I look to thee. In thee alone is my help. Today the rent is long overdue, has been paid by cheque. But Lord, it is to thee I look. 75 pounds is needed, Lord, but little has come. I praise thee for £1.10 and £1, but Lord, thou must increase it, for what are these among so many? And then a few days later, dear Father, nothing from outside yet. Rent again due tomorrow. I have thy promise. It is sufficient, Lord, but thou knowest it is not marketable with the worldling. Please, Lord, put it in local currency. And then half a month later, gracious Lord, after such favour, I, though enriched, am still a beggar. I would now make proof of thy willingness to help us further. There are needs every day, and my private monies are all used. Hear me, for sufficient to meet everything coming. And God did provide for the college. It kept going, and many students kept coming to be trained. So many students that accommodation was bursting at the seams. And so God provided in other ways. Several times in the 1920s, there were nearby houses, and they just didn't sell, and so the vendors lowered the price until the college was able to buy these houses for accommodating students. And those houses are there to this day. We lived in one of them, so that people could be trained for the kingdom around this world. And so students such as Daniel and Lillian, who you might have received their first prayer letter since arriving in the snowy Central Asia just on Friday. Well, the prayer letter came on Friday. Students like them going around the world from this college. And one of their praise points in their letter is for God's provision of all our financial needs in his perfect timing. Benson Barnett says this in another quote. Looking back, principal and students alike thank God for every time we have been driven into a corner. For there we have proved God to be a God of deliverances. And we believe we know him better for the squeeze in the tight corner than we could have known him without it. Sometimes in the squeeze is where we see that God is a providing Father. So may we take a leaf out of Benson Barnett's prayer journal and from the word of Jesus Christ today to seek God's kingdom with sacrifice and an unwavering trust in his provision. Well, let's pray.